Okay. All right. I'll kick it. We're good. It's always so strange. Um, we are grateful for all the folks who are joining us online tonight from all different sorts of spaces, all different sorts of communities who are interested in not just the work of abolition, but also the work of being human, the work of humanity. I'm Jeff Hood, Reverend Dr. Jeff Hood, and I'm more than happy to be with everybody. I serve as Stephen Nelson's spiritual advisor, who is scheduled to be executed Wednesday at 6 o'clock. If Stephen is executed, it'll be the 9th time that I've been with somebody in the execution chamber as they're executed. And tonight, I'm very thankful for well, first of all, Brother Ben here, and Dan, who I always say your last name wrong. I know that's how I knew it was. I knew it wasn't Kennery, and so thank you for hitting me with it. But Dan, I know it doesn't sound like it, but Dan has been my friend for a long time, and I actually met Dan 20. I think it was 2014. We talked about that a little bit earlier, but I think it was 2014, and I was doing this like huge like march from Livingston, the Pulaski unit. This was one of the dumbest ideas I think I've ever had. I was doing this march from Livingston to Austin, to the state capitol. It's one of those things where about day 2, you're sitting there going, "What in the hell was I thinking?" Like, what? So when I was coming through, I guess it's College Station, and Dan came out and met me, and I started hearing about his work at Tiny Hope Village. And Melinda, David, this man is responsible for, well, a lot of people are responsible, but his leadership has pushed for this growing village of tiny homes that are housing unhoused people here in Bryan College Station. And I said this, and this is not going to be an entire evening of me praising Dan, but I did want to say, well, come on, there you go. But I did want to say that Dan has always been one of the folks that I follow who truly lives out the gospel and truly is someone who, doing that shit. Like, no, no, it's not. It's not. But okay, so Dan, you have anything you want to say before we get going?
I just want to thank y'all locally who came out and thank y'all who drove a long way. I think it's really special that we get to talk about Stephen together. I think it's really special that we get to show concern for him and pray for him. Someone who's been so cast off and ostracized by the world. So I just really appreciate y'all being here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dan. Yeah, thank you for being my friend, first and foremost. And Ben, it's been wonderful to see you grow up on Facebook, my friend. I don't get to see Dan all that much. It's been
several years,
5 or 6 years since we've seen each other. It's been awesome.
Yeah.
This is my son, Philip. Do you have any wise things to say? So we have twins that are 12. Philip has a twin brother, and I have a 10-year-old, and then I have twins that are 9.
Wow.
And so they are an unspoken part of this. That and I always tell folks when they talk about like the sacrifices, oh, and that's incredible. It's like, no, my wife is incredible. She's the one that sort of makes all this happen. So I hope she's watching this because I'll have a much better homecoming. But yeah, so I just thought I would get started by sort of talking about Stephen's story. And I see Stephen as sort of this path to a wider conversation about the death penalty that I think we can all engage with. But then what you talking about? Stephen is like a lot of young men of color, and even more than that, like a lot of folks who grow up poor in Texas and Oklahoma and our region, and even more than that, those who grow up without parents that care, those who have mental health issues. I mean, I could go on, but all of these things describe so many people on death row. I'll mention really quick, Linda and David are regular visitors to death row. They even got their awesome t-shirts on. It's important. And Linda is part of this group called the Death Row Angels. And they minister to families of folks who are on death row, who are approaching execution and all such things.
We
And
drove mothers to prison to see their sons. Like last weekend, I took a mother to a unit that her son was at the Styles unit. She hadn't seen him in over 2 years.
wow.
And she had nobody to take her. And so she contacted me and I said, "When do you want to go?"
So this is what I'm trying to say is another saint among us. Some I've known for a while too,
I
but
met him in 2014.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess that's when it came out, 2014.
Yeah.
But well, so yeah, I mentioned all of those different spaces and categories and types of people and blah 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 because Stephen is sort of this juxtaposition, this amalgamation of a lot of what we talk about when we talk about the death penalty. A lot of what we talk about when we talk about people who are sentenced to death. We know that we live in a society, different states. I still, I lived 10 years in Texas, so I still sort of say, oh, don't do that from that. I still say things like we in terms of Texas, but we know that certain things about the death penalty and how it's administered, how it is, who gets the death penalty. We know that persons of color are much more likely to be sentenced to death than anyone else. We know that, as they say, those without capital are eligible for capital punishment. We know that those who are poor are more likely to get the death penalty. And very strangely, a strange piece of, I feel like, conversations about the death penalty is that the death penalty is inherently sexist, but not how you would think. Men are absolutely more likely to be sentenced to death than women, which is why death row populations, female death row populations around the country are so small. I believe in Texas, it's been 6. I forgot Allie was there. I haven't said anything. I said something about you. I'm sorry. So backing up, I'm going to tell a little bit of Stephen's story. Stephen comes from the space in which he was product of a mixed race. His mom is black, dad was indigenous, and so there's all of these sort of spaces and places and people mixed in, just like all the rest of us. And he grew up in Oklahoma, and Stephen has one of the more horrific, like, childhood stories. I mean, they all have. I'll take a quick step back. When the Will Spears case was happening, I got an opportunity to engage with one of the Supreme Court justices in Texas, and they stopped his execution. And I said, "What is it that made you stop this execution?" And she said, I said, "Was it the childhood stuff? I mean, was it all of the horrible things that was in his childhood?" And she said, "Oh no, they all have that." just as flippantly as that, they all have that. And it's so unfortunate that we don't get enough time to engage these folks' childhoods, the struggles. And I'm going to continue talking about Stephen, but I think it's also important to remember as I do that sometimes when we talk about the death penalty and we talk about folks who are about to be executed, we have to begin to talk about what is it that makes us responsible for what happened. We always want to talk about the responsibility of the condemned. We never talk about our responsibility, where we fail as a society. And there is no doubt that we failed Stephen Nelson. Stephen grew up in a home where he was regularly beaten, uh, sexually molested. I mean, just stories that you begin to wonder how human beings could ever do these things, treat each other in such a way. At the age of 12, a psychologist deemed Stephen to be irreparably broken. And the reason we know this is because the psychologist's reports are later brought up in the murder trial later on. And the prosecution used these sort of statements that he's irreparably broken, that there's nothing that can be done to say, see, he needs the death penalty because he can never, ever be restored. And they knew that he couldn't be restored at age 12. That's what the prosecution said during the sentencing phase. So Stephen comes along and, they move to Dallas and he begins to get in trouble as a teenager and begins to get involved in, all sorts of small time criminal activity, robberies and whatnot. I mean, I guess small or big time depends on the juxtaposition with which you're talking about it. But in comparison to a lot of the guys I work with, I'm occasionally talking to folks who killed a dozen people. A robbery seems a little less intense than that. But I think what's important to think about with Stephen is there's this. He's talked to me about there was this cultural phenomenon for him where he's seeing all of this stuff happening around him. Right? He's seeing everybody getting things and what does it look like to advance and have the cars and have the nice clothes and the jewelry and all that kind of stuff. And he tries to start doing it the right way. Because as society would say the right way, he ends up enrolling in college, graduates from high school, enrolls in college. When he enrolled in college, they kicked him out because he had had a previous criminal conviction as a young man. So what we're talking about is a situation in which you have a guy who has tried over and over again, who's gone into, he was in and out of juvenile and such places, but he's going in and out of the services that our society offers, and it's consistently turned away, pushed against. We can't help you. Uh, you can't go to college. You're irreparably broken, and those types of things. So he gets older and eventually come to the incident that ultimately brings us here today. Stephen was a part of a robbery at, let me explain, add one explanation. So North Point Baptist Church is in Arlington, Texas, and First Baptist Church of Arlington. I think some of the church folks might understand this, but I feel like I'm trying to make this a little clearer. North Point Baptist Church was a satellite or plant of First Baptist Church of Arlington. So First Baptist Church of Arlington employed the pastoral staff at North Point Baptist Church. So Stephen was involved in a robbery at North Point Baptist Church, but the whole campaign for him to be executed came out of First Baptist Arlington. And so let me back up, and you'll roll your eyes a couple more times before I get done with this story. But so Stephen goes in, or Stephen participates in this robbery. And one thing you will probably notice about me tonight is I don't talk about these crimes as, I mean, I think there's a lot, Linda knows this. There's a lot of people who talk about these crimes and they say, yeah, it didn't happen. They're all innocent, blah, blah, blah. They're all sweet and blah. That's not true. I mean, some of, like, I mean, I'm convinced that I have met, and don't you tell me, oh, well. I mean, I'm convinced that I have met evil, evil people who should never, ever, ever leave prison. Ever. I mean, folks that if I met on the street, I would run as fast as I could in the opposite direction. But I say that just to say that it's important to talk about these crimes as they happen, the reality of the crimes as they happen. This is a situation in which Stephen partnered with two other folks. He goes in. The part that gets a little debatable or argued is who was the actual killer. But we do know that Clint Dobson had a plastic bag put over his head and he was suffocated to death. I mean, in my mind, one of the more awful ways I can imagine dying. We have a secretary, Judy Elliott, who was there. She was beaten so badly that her husband comes to the church to check on her later and doesn't recognize that it's her. Can't figure out like that this is actually his wife. There are multiple stories at this point. Stephen claims that he was the lookout in the situation, and that he only went in to steal some things, which is why his DNA was in the situation, in the room, and why why he had the stolen goods in his possession and whatnot. The state argued that there were two other people there, that Stephen was the only person that was there, and that he's the only person that was ever involved in the crime, that he beat Judy Elliott and killed Clint Dobson. Complicated, very complicated. And people say, well, what's the truth? The truth is that someone is about to be executed on Wednesday, and it's my job to love him, no matter what happened, no matter what that truth is. And they say, well, what? Aren't you supposed to get him to tell the truth? And I said, no, my job is to love him. Backing up, this thing goes to trial. It was a sensational trial. There at the early 2012, 2013, sensational trial, and the person who is pushing the hardest for Stephen to be executed. I mean, just giving it everything he's got. They're releasing statement after statement. Is the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Arlington, saying that this is God's justice. God demands this. Blood is demanded, which I'm going to take a very quick step in a theological direction and say, this is part of the problem with the way that Christian theology has been formulated. This idea that blood is necessary to make things right is very problematic, because what it does is it consistently creates a situation where people want blood. To me, the message of the gospel is about grace and what can we do to give our lives to other people, not what we can do to take lives from other people. Okay, back on track. So I think that he goes to trial. Lawyers do, I mean, it's the same story over and over and over again. The lawyers are terrible. You never hear of these like elite attorneys, their clients giving the death penalty. It doesn't happen. I mean, the Murdoch crowd in South Carolina. I mean, he was convicted of killing his wife and his son in just absolute horrific, horrible way. No death penalty. Wasn't even a part of the conversation. You got to think about why is that? There's some answers that I think are, for those who are paying attention, are easy, but nevertheless, Stephen goes on trial. He the entire courtroom behind him is filled with members of the church. They're there in support of the Dobson family. And so you have this very strange juxtaposition of the church sending all of these people in who are demanding blood. When Stephen was found guilty, the statement was released. We've been praying for this. Our church has been sitting here for year after, or the last couple of years, and we've been praying for this. And this sort of righteous, like, we won sort of press release. After that, the sentencing phase happens. Ultimately, of course, Stephen receives death. Tarrant County is one of the highest death sentencing states, death sentencing counties in the state. You see person after person coming out of Tarrant County. So he's sent to death row. When this is all happening, Stephen is a lot going on in prison. If you read the articles about him, it's very intense. A lot of fights with the guards. He was actually accused of a murder in prison, or in jail, in the county jail in Tarrant County. Ultimately, the medical examiner ruled it a suicide, but the point is that he was very much this monster. He was portrayed to be a monster. When I asked him, I said, what did it feel like to be in that courtroom? And he said, how would you feel if you were the only black guy and a couple hundred white people around? I mean, how would you feel? And I said, point taken. And, at this point, everything starts kind of coming to a head in that he's sent to death row, and like all good evangelical churches, the church puts out another statement. We are going to, this is a victory. We're doing this. Jesus, this is magnifying Jesus, all these different kinds of things. And they say, we are going to do everything we can do to reach out and to love Stephen. And we want to bring the gospel to him. We want him to get saved. We want to, on and on and on. I mean, y'all heard it before. Here we are, 13 years later. Stephen has never heard one word from the First Baptist Church of Arlington, any of their members, any of their pastors. And I think there's a lot of stories here. There's a lot going on in Stephen's situation, but I can tell you that now the Stephen that I know, very smart, he's very accomplished, he's a great artist. I saw a image that he drew this morning of an eye that was rather stunning. And we've talked a lot about faith together, a lot about life. And I guess I'll quickly talk about what life has been like, or what my relationship with Stephen has been like. When you do this as much as I do, you meet a lot of different personalities. You meet folks that have their faculties. You meet folks that don't. But Stephen has consistently. It's been difficult. I mean, I'm perfectly willing to say that it's been difficult. I mean, imagine that he doesn't like preachers all that much, and pastors or priests. The church has, regularly shit on him, and so he's skeptical of the church. And I remember when I first reached out to him, and a lot of times the guys that I work with will reach out to me, and that'll be how things started. I reached out to Stephen because I didn't want this thing to happen, and this church that's supporting the death penalty, demanding blood, to get the last word. I said, I cannot let that happen. I feel like that is just one of my best quotes I've ever had was in the Texas Observer last week. And I said that the way that First Baptist Arlington has acted, and David, I'm so sorry before you hear this, the way that this situation has played out, I said it's like First Baptist Arlington just bent down and took a huge shit on the face of Jesus. I was so thankful they used that. So thankful. But I was just going to say, though, that I just think that we tend to throw people away. We tend to monsterize people, and we forget about it. Another thing that's very strange that's happening right now. Stephen has two people in his life at the moment. His wife, whom he met on death row, corresponded and met on death row, and me. His family has nothing to do with it. He's got 6 brothers and sisters. He's got people all over the place, and it's because it's easier to not have to deal with this. I think there's a reason why these executions happen in Huntsville, because it's easier for us as a society to not have to deal with this. I think there's a reason why the psychologist said that at the age of 12 that Stephen was irreparably broken, because it's easier to not have to deal with this. But as a follower of Jesus, I don't think that anybody is inhuman, monster, that we were made in the image of God. And thank you, Ben. And that was an amen. And I think that I'll say this really quick, and then we'll move to a wider discussion. But when I first started like getting involved in more like social justice issues and pushing into that time in my life, uh, right after Trayvon Martin, like the sort of early days of BLM. I grew up in Atlanta, so it was very like steeped in civil rights culture and wanting to be involved. And it was interesting how when people started talking about Black Lives Matter, people started talking about Queer Lives Matter, and all these different spaces and places. Obviously, all those things and all those statements are beautiful and um, important. But I couldn't help but start to think, okay, if these lives matter, what about the ones who are at the very, very bottom? What about these folks on death row? What about the queer guy on death row, black guy on death row? And I think that is where I am today. Stephen is somebody that society has said, you are not valuable, you do not matter. The church has said, we want to kill you, you do not matter. We think that you're worthy of, for that matter, being hung in the middle of the sanctuary is what it feels like. But I think that when we go to those places where people are monsterized and dehumanized, I think those are the places that we find God. Those are the places that we find love. And when we go to those places, I think those are the places where we change. And I think if salvation is anything, it's people like Stephen Nelson. It's people like folks that when you and David see, and, Dan, you work with, and if I had more knowledge, I'm sure I would say something wonderful about everyone. But my point is that I always say, when people get mad at me when I say this, I don't understand why, but I always say, all these folks talk about getting saved, talk about how they want to get saved, and you need to get saved. And it's like, saved from what? Saved from what? I think we pushed in this direction of maybe it's better to be talking about becoming something, not being saved from something, but becoming something, namely becoming human. And so I think that my work is about trying to be human with these guys. What you guys say? I had this moment today. I went by this statue, this really beautiful statue of Jesus. God, I hope my bishop isn't going to see this. This statue of Jesus in the Huntsville City Cemetery, and it's this beautiful statue. It's a Christus Victor, and it's a reproduction of a statue in Europe. I was going to name the country, but I'm just not with it, I guess. But can't remember. But anyways, I found myself like sitting there and looking at the statue, and we try to like, the priests, especially pastors, we always try to talk about, oh, we got all this faith. And the reason I'm doing this is because I got all this faith and Jesus is with me and lightning bolts and all that bullshit. And I found myself like just sitting there looking at this statue and like looking up at Jesus and just being like, fuck you, man. Fuck you. Because that's what it felt like. Like what are we doing here? I'm about like, this guy's about to be killed. This is your child. This is somebody that you say you care about. What are we doing here? And I ask those questions every time. But I think sometimes we just have questions that we can't answer. But we do have places that we can go and people that we can love. And perhaps that is the answer. All right, Dan, say something really wonderful. I've been talking for a long time.
Do I need to use this?
I'm sorry?
Do I need to use the microphone?
Yeah.
I was thinking we could maybe, hold on, I'm not trying to cut you off.
Very good.
I was thinking maybe we could sort of kick around a little bit wider of a conversation, thoughts about the death penalty, interactions with the death penalty, questions, anything like that. But go ahead.
Here are my thoughts that came up when you were talking. You're talking about how the psychiatrist said he was irreparably broken. My wife and I, we fostered several kids, and we've been involved in like a larger foster community, folks who foster and adopt. And there's just like certain times in a young child's life where if they don't have like what they need from like a caregiver, if they don't have like a stable caregiver, then they don't develop like attachment. Like they don't have the ability to empathize with another person as well. And it affects them the rest of their life. And sometimes they can overcome it and sometimes they can't. And you see it a lot in like foster and adopts. You see kids with attachment disorder. And it's super difficult because it's like having a child who doesn't attach to you or attach to anybody, and they can be, really harmful. And a lot of times they end up in prison or on death row. And I just think like, what if we saw these people as children, which is exactly what you're saying, where they came from? What if we had mercy on them like you would have on a child? Because that's what they deserve. What if we saw the child who didn't get what they needed? The child who was abused and neglected? Because that's almost always the case. Almost always the case. Like, what was the name of the Mr. Hall? Gabriel Hall, who was sentenced to death out of Brazos County. He lived in a orphanage in Philadelphia, and he was adopted here. He'd been through horrific abuse and neglect, and we sentenced this orphan from an orphanage to death row. Like, could we go any lower than that? Is how I feel. I just wish we would see like the children who these folks came from, who they were. And the other thing I'd have to say is, the only thing I remember from visiting folks on death row, which I haven't done in a while. I just remember leaving, and it's a horrible experience dealing with the prison.
Oh yeah.
It's a horrible experience seeing what they go through. I remember leaving and feeling this profound feeling that like I've experienced the presence of God, even in like the worst place I've ever been. I've experienced the presence of God by being in the presence of this person, and that's all I really have to say about it.
It's interesting, that you say that. I mean, I tell folks that some of the most spiritual moments I've ever had have been escorting these guys and being there with them as they're executed. And it's not because, um, there's anything. It's not because that like it's a beautiful place or there. I mean, it's definitely none of those things. But it seems like when night is the darkest, that's when you're able to most clearly see the light. And so when these guys, I had one of my guys, Michael Smith in Oklahoma, um, April of last year, 2024. He looks up at me and he says, "I love you." And it's like, damn, you spent some of your last breaths to tell me that you love me. That doesn't sound like someone that is beyond redemption, beyond forgiveness. Emmanuel Littlejohn, he was executed in September of 2024. And we were there in the chamber there in McAllister, Oklahoma, is where their death chamber is. And I brought in this little baggie of it was anointing oil, and I pulled it out. And I mean, and again, minutes away from this person being executed, and he says, "Jeff, I hope you brought me some weed." and and in that moment, I mean, it was unbelievably funny, but it was also like, wow, like this is so beautiful. And it's so beautiful because of the difficulty and the destruction of the moment. But I mean, I tell folks all the time, you don't need to be praying for my guys. You need to be praying for the people who are actually carrying out these executions. All right, I'm going to say one more thing and I need somebody else to say something. I think that if the judges and juries that sentence people to death, if they had to carry it out themselves, there would be no death penalty. If people all over the place had to witness what I've witnessed, Linda, what you've witnessed, there would be no death penalty. But again, it goes back all the way to the beginning of Stephen's life. We would rather push people aside. We would rather put people off than actually have to engage. And I think that, oh gosh, I'm gonna sound like such an old curmudgeon when I say this, but I think social media has taken us to an even more difficult hour in that you don't have to engage anybody. I mean, you engage, perfect example. So after Kenny Smith, who was executed by nitrogen, the first nitrogen execution last year, January of 2024. I was with him. It was absolutely horrific. One of the most horrible deaths that you can imagine, thrashing back and forth for almost, I believe it was 22 minutes. And it's unbelievable to me that the state of Alabama is so excited about a new way of killing people. But I say that to say that after that happened, of course, and they might live down here in Bryan College Station, but we always end up getting, anytime these things get any sort of traction, we always get death threats, always. And there's always people that love to call the house and say all kinds of wonderful things. I actually, oh gosh, I said goddamn Donald Trump in my sermon on the 19th, and that brought us a lot of new friends. But to say the least. But I was just gonna say though, this guy calls us up and he says what he's gonna do to the kids. I won't say too much, but and he says, I'm coming and I'll be there at this time and this is gonna happen and blah blah blah. And it probably is not gonna be shocking to anyone that don't rush to call the police about anything. But we called the police, and thankfully, it was a North Little Rock police officer that came, and she was very kind. She was a mother. So there was a automatic connection. It felt like they get this guy's phone number and they call him up. It's unbelievable. This guy was a pastor in Northwest Arkansas making these death threat phone call type stuff. And they said, "Do you want to press charges?" I said, "No." I said, I'd like to talk to him. And so I talked to him, and it wasn't like I thought I was gonna like go like ballistic and be cussing him out and all this kind of stuff. And I just prayed, God, help me to know how to handle this. So I just asked him. I was like, why did you do this? Like, what made you think this was appropriate? And he said, "Well, I saw you on the news, and I saw you on Facebook, and I saw you on all this social media, and I didn't know if y'all were real people or not." That was his answer. And it made me think to myself, I mean, maybe this person was just bonkers, but it did make me think about how we are able to dehumanize each other to the point where we can see someone standing, breathing, walking around and think that's not a real person. Or we can think we can mess with somebody's family and say those aren't real people. But yeah, I mean, it's a bizarre moment for sure. Does anybody else have any wonderful questions or thoughts that they might want to share? Linda, you got anything?
Well, I can say that out of all the guys that I visit and been around, I only met one that scared me. And
Man, I got introduced to some of my other guys.
well, this one it was because he was always so sweet at visits and everything. But on the night before he was executed, he said, I have to tell you something." I said, "What's that?" And he said, "I love you. I've loved your visits. I really, appreciate you sticking by me for all the crimes that I did. But if they were to let me go, I'd do it again."
Oh yeah.
He said, I would kill all the young girls I could get a hold of that were 17, 18 years old. He said, because I still have that yearning. And he said, "So don't mourn for me." He said, "Because I'm going to be somewhere better." And I said, "I appreciate you telling me that." I said, "Yeah, wow." I said, "I was thinking if you ever got out, you'd come live with us."
Hey, you can sleep with David.
It was the honest last visit I had with somebody was and then to tell me that. 'Cause most of the guys are really, I've seen them change. I've seen them come in really violent in the beginning, but after a few years, they change.
Well, I mean, you're talking about people who are sitting down there for 15, 20, 30 years.
Yes.
I mean, we're having folks executed that have been on death and around the country that have been on death rows for. Mm,
He'd been there for, my gosh, 27 years. I think.
wow. We've got, so one of my guys is Thomas Creech in Idaho, and has confessed to killing 42 people. And he has been on death row. Now, the question is, let me make clear, confession and whether he actually did it or not is there's a gray area there. But he has been on death row since 1984. And he was in prison. He's been sentenced to death twice. He was sentenced to death in the early 1970s, and then the death penalty was overturned. And then he killed someone in prison and was sentenced again to death in 1984. But it's I mean, he's bound to a wheelchair. He's almost, I think he's pushing 80 years old, and which is another insane part of this conversation. People who have to be in a wheelchair and wheeled to the execution chamber. Carl Bunchen was like that. Carl was almost 80 years old.
Yes.
Executed, what, 2 years ago, 3 years ago?
I was a witness to his execution. That was horrible on his police officers. Yeah.
Oh yeah, he had killed a Houston police officer back like in the 80s, and this happens from time to time. Is that the police will bring their motorcycles, and they all get their motorcycles lined up, and they rev their engines so that the goal for them is to say they don't want the person's last words to be able to be heard.
There was like a lot of them. There was probably a couple hundred of them, and they like completely like would shut down all the roads, even on a red light. Like it was the most insane thing ever. And I mean, I've been outside of several executions, and nothing was like that. And then me and Barbara, who was a professor at UT Austin at the time,
Lobenthal.
yeah. Her and I got a lot of death threats after that for speaking out against the execution of Carl Bunchen. And when I say death threats, I mean like death threats from police constables, police chiefs all over the state, the Houston Police Union. There was a couple others. Like it was so bad. And thank God I was on a plane like right when the death threats started coming in, going back to where I live, which I will not say on here.
Why
But
not?
it was, yeah, it's bad.
Yeah, she lost her job over this because it was just so, she was a professor at the University of Texas.
Yeah, at first they were like supporting her legally, but then yeah,
She's a wonderful person.
she's great.
Yeah, she
She's
really is a
wonderful.
wonderful person.
This is kind of speaks to the death penalty is our worst impulse. It's like not justice, just revenge, brutish, like that kind of behavior. That wouldn't happen without the death penalty. We wouldn't be out there with
They
murder
called us
sentence.
names as we came out of the chamber, you know, they were calling us names and she shot her finger, so.
Yeah, she walked out
She
of the
was.
death chamber flipping them off.
She was in the Houston Chronicle.
It was actually kind of great.
I don't do that. I don't do that. I try not to. I try to maybe I'll hold of the cross. I don't know. But I was going to tell you one quick story, and then we can start wrapping it up. We're an hour in. But I worked with a guy named Richard Masterson. Linda, you remember Richard?
Yes.
Number of years ago. Richard was, at the time, I was running the social justice ministry that was connected to Cathedral of Hope, United Church of Christ in Dallas. It's a big gay church, literally a big gay church. And they are, I think right now, around about 2,000 LGBT persons on Sunday morning. It's a really incredible space. But nevertheless, at the time, I was doing all of this work with, it was when trans women of color, there was that rash of trans women of color murders in Dallas. And so we were going, and I was partnering with a trans friend of mine, Carmarian Anderson Harvey. She's gotten married since then, but she is amazing. First of all, y'all look her up. She is HRC's director in Alabama, of all places. A trans woman of color fighting for LGBT rights, queer rights in Alabama. Amazing. She really is an amazing person. But we had this really powerful experience. A young trans woman by the name of Shade Schuler was murdered in Dallas, and her body was disposed of in this big field. And me and Carmarian got together, and we said, we really need to do something to have a spiritual moment to commemorate this and let people know that this has happened and whatnot. And so we found ourselves going out in this field, and we had a big group with us. And we couldn't figure out where they found the body because we wanted to go right to that spot and have, a real moment, a sacramental moment. And this guy, he yells from the back of his house, "Oh, yeah, it's all right over there." And we come around the corner, and there's this black spot in the field where the body had decomposed. And you could literally see the outline of the body. And in that moment, it was so powerful, just this beautiful moment of what I would call queer salvation, queer redemption, this belief that our differences are what brings us together, our differences are what heals us. And so I experienced all of this, and it was so beautiful. Richard Masterson, at the same time working with him, Richard Masterson killed multiple trans women in Houston. And that's what he was convicted of. And so I'm holding these two things at the same time, trying to figure out how am I going to be a Christian? How am I going to love Jesus? What does this look like in this moment? And these folks are saying, what the hell are you doing working with this guy? And it brings to this very disturbing spot of what does it look like to follow Jesus? And if you're not going to talk about Jesus, what does it look like to follow love, to be human? And I will never forget Richard Masterson, a very similar experience to Linda, looking at me the last time I was with him and saying, I said, is there anything I can get for you? He said, I wish I could give my hands on one more trans woman. How? Like, and I think those are the spaces that we're called to. And that's a hard road. But I think the reason that I love Dan so much is because I've seen Dan walk that road, that difficult road, for a long time. And I think a lot of the folks that I see, Linda, and do ministry in all these different places and try to love in all of these different ways, I think it's what makes us whole. I always tell folks the craziest thing to tell people in Texas is that your salvation resides in Livingston. That you can't know God, you can't know love, you can't know wholeness until you meet some of these guys. At the very least, till you start meeting other folks who are marginalized and oppressed and throughout the world, or throughout the state, throughout the world. But does anybody else have anything? You got anything? You supposed to? You just been listening. That's good. That's good. I did. Let me give a superlative to this guy real quick, and then I'll be done. Philip, like 3 years ago, we lived in North Carolina for a year. My wife taught at Appalachian State for a year, and I thought that I've lived in Alabama, Mississippi, Texas, all these different places. We moved way up in the hills in North Carolina, and that's about as backwards as I think I've ever experienced. And we moved in, and this was a couple years after the July 7th shooting and officers dying, and of course at that rally I said, "Goddamn white America," so that got played over and over and over again. I think my wife wishes I would quit saying "goddamn" anything, but because we've experienced a lot with that. But anyway, so we moved up there, and these folks decided they didn't want us to be around. They didn't want us to live there anymore. And we had a guy come into the house, that wanted to like do us harm and was, probably messed up in the head or whatever. Philip, at the age of 9 years old, comes out of his room and tells this cat to get out of here, get out of here. He scared him off, saved the whole family. Life is crazy, man. Life is crazy. But love is good. All right, let's pray. you know, you a priest, you always got to end on prayer. Come on. What y'all expect? I just want to do sort of a form of corporate prayer. And I'm going to ask everybody to think of listen, in particular for Stephen. I want to particularly pray for Stephen at this moment. I want you to think of one word that you would like to give Stephen. Maybe hope, maybe love. One word that you would like to give Stephen. And I want us to kind of go around and just offer those words very quickly. Hope, comfort, peace. You go.
Fulfillment.
Freedom.
It's your turn.
Blessed. Blessed. Yeah, thank you. Linda. Mm. Calmness.
Courage.
Courage. Joy. Joy. I say peace too. God, you have heard the groanings of our hearts. Peace, hope, love, fulfillment, all of these words, God, that have been spoken. Bring them to fruition in the life of Stephen Nelson, that every second and every moment he has left might be filled with life and preparation for the life that he will spend forever with you. Amen.